When private thoughts become public revelations, history changes in ways no one expects. What you're about to discover is how one misdirected letter exposed the entertainment industry's darkest secrets and ignited a civil rights revolution that nobody saw coming. This isn't just about a postal mistake. This is about how authentic truth can be more powerful than any planned movement when it reaches the right audience at the perfect moment. Subscribe now for more incredible stories where accidents changed history and private courage became public inspiration. These moments of unintended consequence will show you how truth always finds a way to emerge. What happens when a brutally honest private letter meant for one civil rights leader accidentally reaches the nation's most influential newspaper and exposes an entire industry's hidden racism? On March 8, 1963, Sammy Davis Jr. wrote the most important letter of his life and never intended anyone except Martin Luther King Jr. to read it. A simple addressing mistake turned private confession into public revolution and changed the civil rights movement forever. This is the extraordinary true story of how an accidental revelation started a revolution. March 8, 1963, 11:30 p.m. Sammy Davis Jr. sat alone in his Beverly Hills home, exhausted after another evening of performing for audiences who applauded his talent while systematically excluding him from their social and professional circles. At 38, Sammy had achieved unprecedented success as an entertainer. But that success came with a psychological cost that few people understood. Every performance required navigating a complex web of racial expectations, industry politics, and personal dignity that left him feeling isolated despite his fame. On this particular evening, Sammy felt compelled to write a letter that would finally express the truth about his experience in the entertainment industry. Truth that he had never shared publicly for fear of destroying his career and the careers of other black performers who depended on a system that simultaneously celebrated and constrained them. The letter was intended for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whom Sammy deeply respected but had never met personally. Sammy wanted to contribute to the civil rights movement in a meaningful way, but he also needed to explain why his contributions had to remain largely private and why his public persona often seemed disconnected from the struggle that defined his daily existence. Dear Dr. King, Sammy began, writing in longhand on personal stationery that bore only his name and Beverly Hills address. I am writing to share information that I believe will help you understand the entertainment industry's role in perpetuating the very discrimination that your movement seeks to eliminate. What followed was the most comprehensive and detailed account of entertainment industry racism ever written by someone with Sammy's access and credibility. The public sees me performing for integrated audiences and assumes that entertainment represents progress and racial equality, Sammy wrote. What they don't see is the systematic exclusion that occurs behind the scenes. The hotels that welcome me as a performer but refuse me as a guest, the restaurants that profit from my shows but won't serve me dinner, the record companies that promote my music while maintaining separate marketing strategies for black and white audiences. The letter continued with specific examples that demonstrated how entertainment industry racism operated through policies that were never written down but were universally understood and enforced. Last month, I was scheduled to appear on the Ed Sullivan Show alongside Tony Bennett and Peggy Lee. During rehearsal, the show's producer informed me that my performance would be edited differently for Southern television markets. My interactions with white performers would be minimized to avoid controversy that might affect advertising revenue from companies that sell to segregated markets. Sammy detailed how entertainment industry leaders used economic arguments to justify racial discrimination, claiming that integrated entertainment would reduce profitability and damage business relationships in segregated markets. The most insidious aspect of industry racism is how it disguises itself as business pragmatism, Sammy wrote. Executives don't say they're excluding black performers because of racial prejudice. They say they're protecting advertising revenue, maintaining audience comfort, and preserving industry stability. The letter revealed how this system forced black entertainers into impossible choices between career advancement and personal dignity. Every successful black performer faces the same dilemma. We can achieve individual success by accepting industry limitations, or we can challenge those limitations and risk destroying not just our own careers, but the opportunities available to other black performers who depend on the industry's conditional acceptance. Sammy described how this dynamic created pressure for black entertainers to avoid controversial statements or associations that might jeopardize their carefully negotiated position within an industry that viewed their presence as temporary and conditional. "When I perform for integrated audiences, I represent possibility, proof that talent can transcend racial barriers. But when I speak publicly about discrimination, I become a problem that threatens the comfortable fiction that entertainment industry success equals social progress." The letter's most powerful section detailed specific incidents of discrimination that had never been reported publicly because the victims were too vulnerable to risk industry retaliation. 3 weeks ago, Nat King Cole was refused service at a restaurant in the same hotel where he had just performed for a sold-out audience that paid premium prices to see him. The hotel management apologized privately, but insisted that public disclosure would create unnecessary controversy that would harm both the hotel's reputation and Nat's future booking opportunities. Sammy explained how such incidents occurred regularly but remained hidden because entertainment industry contracts typically included clauses that prevented performers from discussing discrimination experiences publicly. "We sign agreements that protect the industry's reputation by silencing the very people who could expose its hypocrisies," Sammy wrote. "The price of performing for integrated audiences is accepting segregated treatment everywhere else." The letter also revealed the existence of industry blacklists that were used to punish performers who challenged discriminatory practices or spoke too openly about racial issues. "There is an informal but effective system for destroying the careers of entertainers who become difficult about racial issues," Sammy explained. "Booking agents suddenly become unavailable, recording contracts aren't renewed, television appearances get canceled due to scheduling conflicts, and venue managers discover security concerns that prevent performances." Sammy provided specific examples of talented performers whose careers had been systematically destroyed after they challenged industry discrimination or associated with civil rights activities. Billy Eckstine was one of the most talented singers of our generation, but his career was deliberately sabotaged after he refused to perform at segregated venues and spoke publicly about industry racism. Today, most people under 30 have never heard of him, not because he lacked talent, but because the industry erased him for having principles. The letter's conclusion was both an offer of support for Dr. King's movement and an explanation of why that support had to remain largely private. "I want to contribute to the cause of racial equality, but I must do so in ways that don't trigger industry retaliation that would harm other performers who depend on the current system for their survival," Sammy wrote. "My public silence on many issues doesn't represent indifference. It represents strategic caution designed to preserve opportunities for other black entertainers while I work behind the scenes to create change." Sammy sealed the letter in an envelope addressed to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Atlanta, Georgia, and placed it on his desk to be mailed the following morning. But Sammy's exhaustion led to a mistake that would change American history. On his desk were 2 other envelopes prepared earlier that day, one containing routine correspondence to his business manager and another containing a charitable donation to the Washington Post's educational foundation, which supported journalism scholarships. In his fatigue, Sammy placed the Martin Luther King letter in the envelope addressed to the Washington Post, while the charity check went to Dr. King and the business correspondence went to Atlanta. The mistake was discovered 3 days later when Sammy's assistant received confused phone calls from all 3 recipients, trying to understand why they had received materials clearly intended for others. But by then it was too late to prevent the consequences. Katharine Graham, publisher of the Washington Post, had personally opened the envelope containing Sammy's letter, expecting to find routine paperwork related to the educational foundation donation. Instead, she found herself reading the most detailed insider account of entertainment industry racism ever written by someone with credibility and access that could not be questioned. Graham immediately recognized the letter's significance and potential impact. As one of the most influential newspaper publishers in America, she understood that Sammy's revelations could expose systematic discrimination in ways that would be impossible for the entertainment industry to dismiss or deny. But Graham also recognized the ethical complexity of publishing a letter that was clearly private correspondence sent to her by mistake. She called Sammy directly to discuss the situation. "Mr. Davis," Graham said during their phone conversation on March 12th, "I believe you intended this letter for Dr. King, not for our newspaper. However, the information it contains represents a significant public interest story that could advance the cause of civil rights in ways that private correspondence cannot." Sammy was initially horrified by the prospect of his private thoughts becoming public knowledge, understanding immediately that publication would trigger the industry retaliation he had spent years carefully avoiding. "Mrs. Graham," Sammy replied, "that letter contains information that could destroy my career and harm other performers who have done nothing wrong except try to succeed in an unfair system." Graham understood Sammy's concerns, but she also recognized an opportunity to expose institutional racism in ways that could create lasting change rather than temporary publicity. "Mr. Davis," Graham said, "what you've described represents systematic violations of civil rights that affect thousands of people beyond the entertainment industry. Your unique position gives you credibility that could force changes that would benefit everyone facing similar discrimination." The conversation continued for over an hour, with Graham arguing that publication could transform Sammy's individual experience into collective action, while Sammy worried about the personal and professional consequences of exposing industry secrets. Finally, Graham proposed a compromise that would address both concerns. "What if we publish the letter with additional investigation that provides broader context and protects specific individuals while exposing systematic problems?" Graham suggested. "We could use your revelations as the foundation for comprehensive reporting that documents industry-wide discrimination rather than focusing on particular people or companies." Sammy considered the proposal, recognizing that his accidental revelation might create opportunities for change that private discussions could never achieve. "If you're going to publish it," Sammy said finally, "then do it right. Don't just expose the problems, investigate solutions. Show people what change would look like and how it could benefit everyone, not just black performers." On March 18, 1963, The Washington Post published a front-page story titled "The Hidden Barriers: Entertainment Industry Racism Exposed," that used Sammy's letter as the foundation for a comprehensive investigation into discriminatory practices throughout American entertainment. The story didn't just republish Sammy's letter, it used his revelations to guide investigation that confirmed and expanded his allegations through interviews with dozens of industry insiders, civil rights advocates, and performers who had previously been afraid to speak publicly. The impact was immediate and devastating for the entertainment industry's carefully maintained image of progressive racial attitudes. Within 48 hours, civil rights organizations were demanding investigations of specific companies and practices mentioned in the Post story. Congressional representatives called for hearings on discriminatory business practices in industries that received federal tax benefits. Major advertisers began questioning their relationships with networks and venues that maintained discriminatory policies, creating economic pressure that achieved more in weeks than years of private negotiations had accomplished. Most importantly, the story encouraged other performers and industry workers to share their own experiences with discrimination, creating an avalanche of revelations that made continued denial impossible. The Washington Post story gave us permission to tell our own truths, recalled jazz musician Oscar Peterson years later. Sammy had broken the silence, and suddenly everyone could speak without feeling like they were betraying some unspoken code of industry loyalty. The letter's publication also reached Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who incorporated Sammy's insights about economic-based discrimination into civil rights strategies that expanded beyond traditional segregation issues. Mr. Davis's letter helped us understand that civil rights work had to address not just legal segregation, but economic discrimination that used business justifications to maintain racial barriers, Dr. King reflected in a 1964 speech. His revelations showed us that fighting racism required challenging systems that seemed racially neutral but produced racially discriminatory results. For Sammy personally, the letter's publication created exactly the professional challenges he had feared, but it also generated unexpected support that helped him weather industry retaliation. "Some executives tried to blacklist me after the story came out," Sammy recalled years later, but public attention made it difficult for them to retaliate openly, and the civil rights publicity actually increased demand for my performances from venues that wanted to demonstrate their commitment to integration. More importantly, the letter's publication connected Sammy with civil rights leaders who had previously viewed entertainment industry figures as too compromised to be reliable allies. Dr. King called me after the story was published, Sammy remembered. He thanked me for helping him understand how economic discrimination worked, and invited me to contribute to civil rights work in ways that used my industry knowledge rather than requiring me to abandon my career. The accidental revolution triggered by Sammy's misdirected letter contributed to broader civil rights legislation that addressed economic discrimination and helped establish legal frameworks for challenging systematic barriers that used business justifications to maintain racial exclusion. Sammy's letter showed us that racism wasn't just about separate water fountains, observed civil rights historian Taylor Branch. It was about economic systems that maintained inequality through practices that seemed racially neutral but produced racially discriminatory results. The entertainment industry changes forced by the letter's publication included new contract language that prohibited discriminatory treatment clauses, integration requirements for venues that received certain types of business licensing, and transparency rules for advertising and marketing practices that had previously operated through informal segregation. For journalism, the incident demonstrated how accidental revelations could expose systematic problems that deliberate investigation might never uncover, because insiders were too afraid or too invested in existing systems to speak openly. Sammy's letter gave us information that we never could have obtained through traditional reporting, recalled Post reporter Carl Bernstein. It showed us that the most important stories sometimes come from sources who never intended to become sources. The legacy of the accidental letter extends beyond its immediate civil rights impact. It established precedent for using insider knowledge to expose systematic discrimination and demonstrated how individual courage could trigger collective action when supported by platforms that could amplify private truth into public change. I never meant for that letter to become public, Sammy reflected years later, but I learned that sometimes accidents can accomplish what deliberate action cannot. The truth found its way to the right audience at the right time, and it created change that I never could have achieved through private conversation alone. The letter that was never meant to be sent became one of the most important documents of the civil rights era, proving that authentic truth could be more powerful than calculated strategy when it reached people willing to act on the revelations it provided.